Order, please. The subject for the late night debate tonight has been submitted by the MLA for Kings West. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia government immediately establish a plan to help address the challenges facing the many cattle producers in Nova Scotia. Daily routine. Presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 14th session of the Council of the Atlantic Premiers will meet tomorrow in Halifax, and whereas CAT meetings provide an excellent opportunity for Atlantic Premiers to find common ground in which to work to move our region forward, and whereas it is also an important time to share ideas and identify potential joint opportunities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House welcome our neighbouring premiers to our capital city as they join me in continuing our work to promote the long-term economic competitiveness of the region. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Order of Canada is Canada's highest honour for lifetime achievement, recognizing people who have made a significant difference to Canada. And whereas Alistair MacLeod was recently made an Officer of the Order of Canada, and whereas this renowned writer who returns to Cape Breton each summer is the author of the international best-selling novel No Great Mischief, as well as 2 collections of short stories, The Lost Salt Gift of Blood and As Birds Bring Forth the Sun. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Mr. MacLeod on the receipt of this prestigious award and wish him well in his future pursuits. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2007 Sobey Art Award celebrates the passion and talent of Canada's contemporary young artists with a prize of $50,000, and whereas the 2007 Sobey Art Award was presented at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia in Halifax on the evening of October 15th, and whereas Michel De Bruyne, an innovative young artist and sculptor from Quebec, was announced the winner of the 2007 Sobey Award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Michel on this achievement and his contribution to art in Canada. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate. Having some difficulty there, but it got pulled together. Request waiver of notice and passage without debate. Thank you.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Winter Lights celebration, the cold weather partner of communities in bloom, this year awarded 5 stars to the Mulgrave Park Tenants Association in Halifax. And whereas the Winter Lights Committee recognized the association for demonstrating a common focus of community participation, beautification, neighbourhood and heritage awareness. And whereas the Department of Community Services is proud to support the proactive work of the Mulgrave Park Tenants Association through the Metropolitan Regional Housing Authority. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Mulgrave Park Tenants Association for its positive influence that is evidenced not only by their 5-star designation, but also by a decrease in vandalism and graffiti in the area. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas breast cancer affects many Nova Scotians every year, and every year we make great strides in this province to improve the survival rate. And whereas government through the Nova Scotia breast screening program has invested $2.4 million this year in new digital mammography units for Yarmouth, Cobequid Health Centre, and the first digital traveling unit in the country. And whereas at the moment 58% of eligible women who need a mammogram are getting one, a number that leads the country and can still be improved upon. Therefore, be it resolved that this House thank all stakeholders for their continued good work for the benefit of Nova Scotians suffering from the effects of breast cancer, and offer patients and their families our best wishes and support. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'll be reading this on behalf of the Minister of Military Relations. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the crew of HMCS Toronto left Halifax on July the 20th as part of a NATO operation, and whereas while in the Red Sea, members of HMCS Toronto rescued a Yemeni soldier who had fled the sea after a volcano erupted on the Jabal al-Tar island and recovered the bodies of 2 deceased soldiers. And whereas friends and family of HMCS Toronto crew members are excitedly anticipating the return of these Canadian heroes next Tuesday, December the 18th. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House offer a well-deserved Bravo Zulu to Commander Stephen Virgin, the officers and crew of HMCS Toronto, welcome them home, thank them for their service to their country, and wish them all a happy and healthy holiday season with their friends and loved ones. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Emergency Management.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia is a member of the International Emergency Management Compact with 4 other provinces and 6 American states. And whereas provincial officials attended the organization's fall meeting in Rhode Island. And whereas Nova Scotia, as Canadian co-chair, has offered to lead a major international emergency management exercise in the spring of 2008. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge the leadership role of our Emergency Management Office and other provincial contributors who are working to make this cross-border partnership such a successful initiative. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Canadian Red Cross made a presentation today at Central Kings Rural High School, where a campaign started in September when scores of students wore pink after a new student was bullied for wearing a pink shirt. And whereas Central Kings is joining a growing number of high schools offering the newly introduced Canadian Red Cross program Beyond the Hurt, which is designed to teach bullying and violence prevention techniques. And whereas the Canadian Red Cross has recently launched a new website which offers information and tips on how to prevent bullying at school and online, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Canadian Red Cross on the launch of their new website and extend our appreciation for their innovative program to stop bullying. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Country Music Hall of Fame recognizes the music of dedicated performers and others who have made an impact on the country music industry. And whereas the induction ceremonies for the Nova Scotia Country Music Hall of Fame took place on September 15th in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. And whereas this year's inductees included musicians and songwriter Lynn Kroll, instrumentalist Keith Ross, and vocal duo Roy and Francis Rudolph. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize and congratulate this year's inductees to the Nova Scotia Country Music Hall of Fame for their lifelong achievement and the recognition of their work. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage with debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister for Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas seniors in the province of Nova Scotia have more opportunities to gain health literacy skills and raise self-confidence through community-based literacy programs, co-sponsored by the Department of Education and the Department of Seniors. And whereas we know that active participation by seniors in learning activities is essential to maintaining independence and quality of life, and that literacy is an important determinant of health. And whereas members of the Valley Community Learning Association and the Grandmothers International Storytelling Circle work to help seniors improve their basic skills in order to ensure they continue to be engaged in all aspects of social, community, and economic life. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House congratulate the Valley Community Learning Association and the Grandmothers International Storytelling Circle on their receipt of the inaugural 2007 Seniors Literacy and Learning Partnership Award, granted jointly by the Department of Education and the Department of Seniors. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister for Community Services.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Youth Development Initiative Program through the Department of Community Services helps youth in Nova Scotia prepare to get jobs by assisting them in developing a resume and references, and then helps them find a job. And whereas the program also works to match youth with an idea for a project that helps their community with the funds to make it happen. And whereas all of this helps move the youth in Nova Scotia towards education, leadership, and skill development. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend the hard work the staff of Employment Support Services and the Youth Development Initiative Program in particular do every day to help youth in Nova Scotia achieve their full potential. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's public school curriculum is designed for students to gain the literacy and numeracy skills required to learn, live, and work successfully, and whereas the 2006 Progress in International Reading Literacy Study measured the reading achievements of grade 4 students in Nova Scotia and across the world, and whereas grade 4 students from each of Nova Scotia's 8 school boards performed at or above the international average and outperformed their counterparts in England and the United States and 26 other countries in the assessment, therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House extend congratulations to school boards, teachers, and parents for being enthusiastic partners in making our literacy initiatives work and helping to ensure success for Nova Scotia students today and in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 197 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Health Services and Insurance Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 197 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Health Services and Insurance Act.
Bill 100, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 197 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Health Services and Insurance Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Appointment and Duties of a Commissioner to Ensure the Fair Access to Regulated Professions.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act Respecting the Appointment and Duties of a Commissioner to Ensure the Fair Access to Regulated Professions.
Bill 101, entitled An Act Respecting the Appointment and Duties of a Commissioner to Ensure the Fair Access to Regulated Profession.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Bill 102, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Process to Implement Senior Home Medication Reviews.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Process to Implement Senior Home Medication Reviews.
Bill 103, entitled An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Process to Implement Senior Home Medication Reviews.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to amend Chapter 18 of the Municipal Government Act of 1998.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Bill 104, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The honourable, the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act, to permit the operation of businesses that assist others in the making of beer, wine, or cider.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act, to permit the operation of business that assist others in making of beer, wine, and cider.
Bill 105, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act, to permit the operation of businesses that assist others in the making of beer, wine, or cider.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act to amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Status 1989, the Income Tax Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, An Act to Amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Income Tax Act.
Bill 106, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Income Tax Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotian Crystal was founded 12 years ago by investors who believe in Nova Scotia and who were committed to age-old, high-quality crafts. And whereas Nova Scotia Crystal has established a good name for itself and has taken our province's name around the world with products of the best quality. And whereas Dennis Ryan, regarded by most as the founder of Nova Scotia Crystal, recently ended his involvement with the company, which is now profitable and more successful than ever. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Dennis Ryan for the business sense, community spirit, and creativity that he brings to our province, as evidenced by the success achieved through the many years of effort and investment in Nova Scotia Crystal. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Preston Area Learning Skills Society was founded in 1987 as the North Preston Community School Program, and whereas in 1988 the Preston Area Learning Skills Society expanded to include Lake Loon, Cherrybrook, and East Preston, as well as changed its name to the Preston Area Learning Skills Society, PALS, and whereas the Preston Area Learning Skills Society celebrated their 20th anniversary on April 19, 2007. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the enormous contributions made by the Preston Area Learning Skills Society and congratulate them on their 20th anniversary. And ask for waiver.
There's a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Southside Bullardry Fire Department was founded in the summer of 1982, and whereas the Southside Bullardry Fire Department held a special ceremony August 25th celebrating this important 25-year milestone and anniversary, and whereas the Southside Bullardry Fire Department provides fire protection and promotes fire safety within their coverage area. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud Chief David McIntyre and the Southside Bullardry Fire Department on their 25th anniversary and thank its members, both past and present, for their dedication and commitment to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal has ruled that workers who were injured and developed chronic pain on the job before April the 17th, 1985 should be assessed for benefits, and whereas there is now legal clarity on the issue of pre-charter chronic pain cases after many years of debate concerning these workers' rights, and whereas the Minister of Environment and Labour has stated publicly that he will ensure that an assessment process be put in place to expedite these cases, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly look forward to the fair and speedy outcomes of these chronic pain assessments by the Workers' Compensation Board. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the following resolution. Whereas the Lieutenant Governor's Award are presented to one female and one male student at each high school who have excelled in their studies and shown great leadership and service to their community. And whereas Laura Fitzpatrick is this year's female grade 11 recipient from Queen Elizabeth High School in Halifax. And whereas Laura is an extremely talented vocalist and pianist who has performed at many events throughout Halifax, as well as an avid soccer player and runner while reaching her academic goals. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House congratulate Laura Fitzpatrick for receiving the Lieutenant Governor's Award and wish her continued success in her future endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2007 Atlantic Firefighters Extrication Competition was held at the Hants County Exhibition Grounds during Sam Slick Weekend on August 3rd and 4th. And whereas a Transportation Emergency Rescue Committee consisting of firefighters from Windsor, Brooklyn, and Somerville Fire Departments, and chaired by Windsor Fire Department Lieutenant Jason Cochran, came together to organize and host the event for the first time ever in Windsor. And whereas Brooklyn Hants County firefighters won the Atlantic Challenge, defeating 9 other fire departments, while in the process assisted in the education of firefighters from around the Maritimes, to learn from and challenge one another. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud the exceptional organizing abilities of Chair Jason Cochran and his fellow firefighters from Windsor, Brooklyn, and Hantsport in organizing such a unique and educational Atlantic Canadian event in Windsor. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas agriculture is an industry that contributes millions of dollars to the economy of Nova Scotia as well as a way of life, and whereas the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture endeavours to speak for farmers and their issues, and whereas Mr. William Willie Versteeg of Milford Station has been chosen as the new president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, therefore be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate William Versteeg on his new position as president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture and wish him success in representing agriculture in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Judy Bro of West Arishat, Richmond County, started her career as a healthcare provider 34 years ago. Whereas Judy Bro is credited with starting a diabetes education center at St. Anne's Community and Nursing Care Center in Arishat 31 years ago, which included educating residents with diabetes and incorporating an ophthalmology clinic with the support of St. Martha's Hospital. Whereas staff, board members, and residents of the area gathered at the New Horizons Seniors Club in Arishat to celebrate Judy's retirement and thank her for her leadership in community health education and illness prevention. Therefore, be it resolved, the Nova Scotia House of Assembly recognize the leadership and hard work of Judy Bro in establishing the Diabetes Education Centre, helping make St. Anne's Community and Nursing Care Centre a model in community health care, and wish her well in her retirement. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mrs. Isabel Izzard was recently commended for her contribution to business in Pictou County for over 40 years at Izzard's Grocery in New Glasgow, and whereas she opened the doors back in 1963 and still runs the operation with her son Jim and loves meeting local residents that visit her store, whereas Mrs. Izzard continues to do volunteer work at Shepherd's Lunchroom in New Glasgow and keeps a watchful eye on her neighbourhood while still selling penny candy. Mrs. Izzard has been an inspiration and a help to many in her community and believes that one will always benefit from helping others. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their warmest wishes and thankful appreciation for the more than 40 years of trade that Mrs. Izzard has conducted and her contribution to business in Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2007 Pictou County Walk to Cure Juvenile Diabetes held in September was the most successful yet, raising $50,000 for the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. And whereas this year's event had great community support from numerous sponsors and participants and actually consisted of a 5-kilometer and a 10-kilometer run, a community walk, and a gala fundraising dinner held at the Pictou Lodge. And whereas the goal of the Pictou County Walk for Juvenile Diabetes is to raise awareness and to help fund research that will one day lead to a cure. Therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Crystal McKinnon Murray and all who contributed to the success of the 2007 Pictou County Walk for Juvenile Diabetes and wish them continued success in the years to come. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Richmond Academy Hurricane Girls Volleyball team is off to another strong start this academic year. Whereas the Hurricanes recently captured the Highland Region Division II banner by defeating the Sarek Saints in a best-of-5 match, allowing them to move on to the provincial championship. Whereas the team consists of Captain Micheline Boudreau, Denise Sanson, Carly Sanson, Ashley Boudreau, Marielle Landry, Shelby Giroir, Kelsey Brochette, Charcy Britton Boudreau, Terrelyn Boudreau, Mireille Landry, and coaches Nancy Britton and Chuck Boudreau. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate the Richmond Hurricane girls volleyball team on winning the Highland Region Division II banner and wish them continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas university student Josh Eiking of Millville, Cape Breton, is proving to be an exceptional salesperson and team leader, and whereas Josh, through his employer First Line Security, recruited individuals from major universities across Nova Scotia, and that team did over $3 million in sales this past summer. And whereas the sales by Josh and his team literally came from making cold calls for one of the fastest growing privately owned companies in the United States, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize Josh and his team for their tremendous work ethic in achieving this level of sales, while wishing them continued success with all their future endeavors and studies. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Fletcher's Lake resident Frida Duffy has been a dedicated member of the Waverley Legion Dieppe Branch number 90 for nearly 40 years, and whereas Frida Duffy has given countless hours volunteering with the Ladies Auxiliary at the Waverley Legion, playing an especially important role in strengthening the Ladies Auxiliary when membership numbers were declining, and whereas Frida was granted the honor of a lifetime membership award by Dieppe Branch 90 in October 2007. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly commend Frida Duffy for her 40 years of volunteerism and dedicated service at the Waverley Legion, Dieppe Branch 90. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Exhibitions Association of Nova Scotia was incorporated in 1973 and continues to be actively involved in supporting and administering agricultural fairs and exhibitions throughout the province, and whereas agricultural fairs and exhibitions are an excellent way to attract tourists to the rural areas of Nova Scotia, leading to a positive contribution to the local economy, and whereas the Exhibitions Association of Nova Scotia relies heavily upon contributions from the Government of Nova Scotia to help make these fairs and exhibitions a success, therefore be it resolved that the Government continue to fund these important events and investigate the matter of increasing funding in the future to cover costs associated with inflation and the pressing demand of meeting safety issues. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Hants West on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome to the House today my wife Leslie and daughter Erica. It's nice to have you here for a few minutes. I'd like everyone to give them a warm welcome. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the West Hants Chamber of Commerce is a vibrant mix of robust companies wanting to promote their local businesses, their business interest to a network of groups and individuals. And whereas the Chamber held their annual Business Awards reception at King's Edgehill in the late spring. And whereas 4 prominent local businesses were recognized for 2007, and they were Brooklyn Office Supplies in the micro business segment, the Wood Char Inn and the Coco Pesto Bistro in the small business category, Minas Basin in the large business group, while Mermaid Theatre captured 2007 President's Choice Award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate these 4 outstanding and successful businesses for helping and wanting to make Hants West a shopper's destination. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Kodli Society of Canada is a non-profit organization named after Hungarian musician and educator Zoltan Kodli, and whereas the Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy applied for the Kodli Society of Canada Award last spring for the hard work their music teacher puts into the music program at the school, receiving the 2007 Music Education Excellence Certificate. And whereas the students of Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy, over 430 students from grades 2 to 6, take part each year in Christmas concerts and music festivals, learn how to play records and the ukulele. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy's music teacher, Andrea Croce, for her strong belief in music education and ongoing commitment to the music program at Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the pineapple is a centuries-old symbol of greeting and generous hospitality, and when a European colonist brought the now familiar pineapple to North America, our nautical ancestors placed a pineapple on their porch, door, or entrance after returning from a long voyage, welcoming visitors into their home to celebrate, announcing to all, our voyage is over, our door is open, food and drink for everyone. Whereas the Nova Scotia Pineapple Awards recognize individuals who have gone above and beyond that as expect to enrich a visitor's stay in Nova Scotia. Whereas this year's recipients are Carol and Bill Finstamaker for Elle Maison de Mata Bed and Breakfast, and John McClellan, a taxi driver in Antigonish, and Fraser and Ina Chasabasso, soul of Malagash. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate these hospitable Nova Scotians on winning this award and thank them for making tourists feel at home in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there was a sad group of students at Trenton Middle School recently as they bid farewell to their friends from China. Whereas 15 Chinese exchange students said goodbye to the community, leaving a void amongst their peers. Where aside from curriculum differences, the two groups had much in common, with a trip to a Mooseheads game in Halifax, a resounding highlight for the group. And whereas the special guests enjoyed their 5-month stay in the province, billeted with local families, where an emphasis was placed on practicing their English language skills, and they returned to favor with tutorials in math and science. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their best wishes to the community of Trenton Middle School and its 15 Chinese students as they completed an extremely successful exchange program that allowed for the special visitors to take part in all Nova Scotia has to offer and for the important lessons our students learn about the world beyond our shores. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas healthcare professionals deserve our thanks and profound respect, and whereas the staff of the Inverness Consolidated Memorial Hospital help local residents stay mobile and treat injuries and disease through their physiotherapy clinic, And whereas with an aging population in Nova Scotia, physiotherapy services are more important and necessary than ever. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate and thank the dedicated staff delivering physiotherapy services at the Inverness Consolidated Memorial Hospital and all healthcare providers throughout Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to read my resolution in French first. Monsieur le Président, en date ultérieure, je demanderai l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que les lauriers de la PME ont été présentés à Ottawa le 10 novembre en reconnaissance de l'importance des entreprises francophones à l'extérieur du Québec, et attendu que UJ Robichaud Timber Mart de Metegan Center a reçu le laurier de la PME de l'entreprise de service pour le service remarquable offert à sa clientèle, et attendu que Marc Robichaud, représentant la 5e génération qui dirige cette entreprise familiale, a reconnu que ce sont les employés qui constituent la force derrière le succès. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu que tous les membres de cette Assemblée félicitent UJ Robichaud Timber Mart d'avoir reçu ce prix et lui souhaitent un succès continu dans le cadre de son 140e anniversaire cette année. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. Adopté, oui. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the laureate de la PME Awards were presented in Ottawa on November 10th, recognizing the importance of francophone businesses outside of Quebec, and whereas UJ Robichaud Timber Mart from Metegan Centre received a laureate de la PME Award for service, recognizing the outstanding service they provide to their customers, and whereas Mark Robichaud, who represents the 5th generation running the family business, recognized that their employees are the strength behind their success, therefore it be resolved that members of this House of Assembly congratulate UJ Robichaud Timber Mart for their award and wish them continued success as they celebrate their 140th anniversary this year. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there are thousands of Boston Red Sox fans in our province, including the Blue Nose Bo Sox Brotherhood, whom are a big part of the faithful Red Sox nation. And whereas the Red Sox win this year of the World Series delighted many
Order,
Nova
please.
Scotians.
Getting very difficult to hear.
Speaker, whereas the Red Sox win this year in the World Series delighted many Nova Scotian fans, and whereas thanks to the strong fan base, the team is including Nova Scotia on its World Series trophy tour, a rare Canadian inclusion for an American team indeed. And therefore be it resolved that all members of the House thank our neighbours in Boston and their world-class team for bringing the trophy to our shores, rewarding their many fans, and congratulate all those avid Red Sox fans who helped ensure Nova Scotians will have a chance to glimpse the famous baseball World Series trophy up close. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I'd like to make an introduction. And if I could draw attention to the West Gallery, my sister Susan Kendall is here. She's mad at me now for introducing her. It's her first visit to the legislature, so she's from the Bridgewater area, and she's made the trip in. If I could ask for the House to offer her a warm stand-up, Susie, and we'll give you a nice warm... It's Christmas. She'll still love me.
The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 18 years ago, dedicated residents of Eastern Passage and Cow Bay organized a tree trimming party as a way to celebrate the spirit of Christmas and raise money for local families. And whereas people purchase bows, which have lovingly been made by seniors of the community, and they write a heartfelt message to the community and place the bows on the community trees. And whereas the sale of bows, an integral part of the event, raises money for worthwhile causes in the community, and whereby each year local residents take time out of their busy schedules to plan the event, which includes caroling, festive treats, Santa, and the lighting of community Christmas trees, encouraging community partnership and community spirit. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Eastern Passage Cow Bay Tree Trimming Committee on their 18th annual tree lighting and wish residents of Eastern Passage and Cow Bay many more years of continued success and community spirit. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1918, Frances Fish became the first woman admitted to the Nova Scotia Bar, paving the way for future generations of women lawyers in our province. And whereas the 2007 Frances Fish Women Lawyers Achievement Award was presented to Darlene Jamieson, QC, for the commitment she has made to improving women's equality in the Nova Scotia Barristers Society. And whereas Ms. Jamieson is an active member of the National Association of Women in the Law, she has served as a mentor to many young women lawyers and has committed her time and expertise to many boards and commissions which serve to enhance the quality of life of women. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Darlene Jamieson, QC, on receipt of the Frances Fish Women's Lawyers Achievement Awards for 2007 and wish her continued success in future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Antigonish teacher and coach Dave Kearney was honoured with the Hugh Noble Award for distinguished service and outstanding contribution to school sports. And whereas Dave Kearney is well known and respected educator who has coached junior and high school soccer for 27 years. And whereas the prestigious award is given out to a teacher in the Strait Regional School Board once every 4 years, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House join me in congratulating Dave Kearney on receiving the Hugh Noble Award. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Tuesday, October 23, 2007, the championship game of the May Quebec Memorial Green and Gold Hockey Tournament took place, and whereas Sydney Academy Wildcats took home the championship honours by defeating the Riverview Redmen, and whereas Jason Kalanko was selected Tournament Most Valuable Player, as well as being selected to the All-Star team, and Brandon Morrison was chosen All-Star Goaltender. Therefore, be it resolved this House of Assembly congratulate the Sydney Academy Wildcats on their championship win. Jason Kalanko was being named the Tournament Most Valuable Player, Brandon Morrison as All-Star Goaltender, and wish the Sydney Academy Wildcats all the best in the season at hand. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ian Burrows, a resident of Glace Bay and a fourth-year nursing student at Cape Breton University, was the guest speaker at the grand opening of Sydney's Blood Services Clinic in April. And whereas Ian has been the recipient of over 200 transfusions of A-positive blood products for neuroblastoma cancer. And whereas Ian is a wonderful example of our youth giving back to the community while also educating the public about the simple act of donating blood. Therefore, be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly congratulate Ian Burrows for his work on behalf of the Sydney Blood Services Clinic. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Clarence Beckett, QC, a senior partner in the Truro office of Patterson Palmer, was recently inducted as a Fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers, one of the most prestigious legal associations, and whose membership is restricted to the best trial lawyers in North America. Whereas Clary Beckett, QC, a Dalhousie Law graduate, who was admitted to the bar in 1971, has practiced civil litigation and insurance law, specializing in the defense of professional liability claims on behalf of professional associations. Whereas Clary Beckett, QC, has served as chairperson of numerous committees of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society, is a past member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Bar Insurance Association, and a past member of the Management Board of the CBIA. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House congratulate Clary Beckett, QC, on being recognized as one of North America's best trial lawyers through his induction as a Fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers, and wish him many more years of successful practice. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without
There has
debate.
been a request for a waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Saturday, September 22nd, the Beachville United Baptist Church Ladies Auxiliary hosted a book launch of their cookbook, A Pinch of This and a Pinch of That. And whereas this wonderful cookbook not only contains fabulous recipes from local residents, but also some insightful history. Whereas this cookbook was coordinated by Ada Thompson and Bernadette Hamilton Reed. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Beachville United Baptist Church Ladies Auxiliary on the publication of their cookbook, A Pinch of This and a Pinch of That. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Lieutenant Governor's Awards are presented to one female and one male student at each high school who have excelled in their studies and shown great leadership and service to the community and school. And whereas Colleen Elizabeth McNeil is this year's female recipient from Bridgetown Regional High School. And whereas Colleen is extremely active on school committees, athletic teams, as well as in her church community and political organizations while maintaining a 90-plus average. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House congratulate Colleen Elizabeth McNeil for receiving the Lieutenant Governor's Awards and wish her continued success in future endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
I hereby give notice that on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bedford South School is participating in Project China, which is a program to allow students from Suzhou, China to learn and experience Nova Scotia and the Canadian culture with a host family. And whereas by providing a home during their visit for these students, the host families have the greatest impact on experiencing the Nova Scotia culture and language. And whereas these visiting students, upon their return home, will have vastly improved their English language skills and be able to tell their families and friends in China what a remarkable culture we have in Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House extend their thanks to John and Joanne McCallum of Bedford for opening their home and sending these students back to China with a truly Nova Scotia experience. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. There has been a request to revert back to the presenting and reading petitions. Is it agreed? The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the indulgence of the House. I beg leave to table a petition which includes 615 names. The operative clause of the petition reads, I support the minister to amend the provincial laws and regulations to allow facilities where an individual can make their own wine or beer for personal consumption and not for commercial use, also known as UVince or brew on premise. I support the minister to allow these facilities, which will create needed jobs and support the economy. And Mr. Speaker, I have affixed my signature to that petition.
The petition is tabled. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members. The time is 1:02, and we will go to 2:02. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My first question will be for the Premier. In today's paper, the comments made by the Minister of National Defence make it appear more likely that the IMP contracts to refurbish the Auroras will be cancelled in next week's announcement, which will put Nova Scotian jobs in jeopardy. IMP has been carrying out engineering and structural upgrades, and much of this work has been done here in Nova Scotia. To quote the Premier, "It's very important to employment. We have good-paying, solid jobs, and the federal government has a good aircraft there. And it's my hope that we will be pushing forward aggressively to ensure that that continues." So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, what is his government doing to protect those good-paying jobs at IMP?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I share my honourable colleagues' belief that those are good-paying jobs in our province, and that's why this government has been so supportive of growing the aerospace industry in our province, Mr. Speaker, since day one, and will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have already written the Minister of Defence around this issue. In fact, the Minister of Economic Development has taken the opportunity to do so, to put forward our position.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps the Premier would like to table that correspondence. We'd certainly like to have a look at it. When he created the Cabinet position for military relations, the media release stated, "The Minister will oversee the province's Defence Forum, an interdepartmental committee of provincial staff who promote and support the relationship with the Department of National Defence and Canadian Forces." So my follow-up for supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is this: what message has he given to the Minister of Military Relations to convey to the Department of Defence?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for military relations, as well as all ministers, carry the same message, Mr. Speaker, and that is we support the aerospace industry, we support the work that is being carried on there, and we hope that we want that work to continue.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no other reason for a Nova Scotian Minister of National Defence to delay such a decision other than it being bad news that he hopes to hide. Why the federal government might want to take this contract away from Nova Scotia and potentially give it to Bombardier is a question I suppose best left to Peter MacKay to answer. With mere days before the final decision is announced, my question to the Premier is this: what is the Premier's plan to keep those contracts here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Economic Development to refer to some of the aspects contained in his letter.
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I don't have the copy of the letter here with me today, but we'll certainly table that at the earliest opportunity. But in that letter, Mr. Speaker, we made it very clear to the Government of Canada how important this industry is to the economy of the province of Nova Scotia, and underlined the need for that level of economic activity to continue into the future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. Last week it was brought to my attention that the residents of an entire street in Berwick, living in mobile homes, have not been receiving their tax rebate on heating oil. Many of these people are seniors on fixed income. The department has been notified and nothing has been done. So my question to the Minister is, if these homes are clearly residential, why are you forcing people to pay tax on their home heating oil?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker, and if the honourable member would give me details on that, I'd be prepared to look into it.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department has been notified several times about this street, and particularly by one resident, Ms. Coyne. She has not received the rebate all year and has been forced to pay tax on her oil bill for the full year. The oil company wants to give the rebate, and the company has notified the department of the situation of Ms. Coyne and the entire street in Berwick. Yet, the department refuses to act. So my question to the minister is, if the oil company wants to give her the rebate at the door, and she's clearly living in a residence that is not commercial, why is your department saying no?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, this is a $75 million program that benefits many, many Nova Scotians, and I'm pleased that the honourable member gave me the opportunity to praise it a little bit more. Mr. Speaker, that's a program that, despite the enormity of it, and it was big, because in fact most of the residents of the province has a tribute to our staff, how well that has been implemented and the adjustments that were made in making it. And some people in this House know that there had to be adjustments made to that, particularly with small suppliers, when we began the program. So again, Mr. Speaker, I offer the honourable member, if he would care to provide me with some detail on this, then I would ask staff to look at it. Good.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, his staff knows about it. I would assume his staff would give him detail if the minister is actually listening and paying attention. Many of our seniors are forced to buy oil several times throughout the year because their fixed income does not allow the purchase of a full tank. These are the very people that we should be providing rebates to in this province, and yet the government refuses to make this process easy for them. You took away the $250 Keep the Heat rebate, and now you are forcing some to pay tax on their oil. So my question to the minister is, will you do the right thing, bring back Keep the Heat, and allow Ms. Coyne the rebate on her oil?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I think he is sort of, what do you call it, confused two things. You can't do them both, and we've opted to do the one which has benefited most Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question will be for the Premier. Last May, the Premier spoke at his own symposium on the Atlantic Gateway, and he said, this year Nova Scotia will develop and implement an aggressive gateway marketing strategy. It will work to maximize the province's full potential as a strategic international transportation gateway. Well, today, Mr. Speaker, we read that traffic in the Halifax port will dip below 500,000 TEUs, its worst year since 2000. So I'd like to ask the Premier if he wouldn't mind updating us on his aggressive gateway marketing strategy.
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I find it hard to believe my colleague across the way does not share my belief in the infrastructure and the opportunities that we have here in the Port of Halifax that we have as a province, Mr. Speaker. We're well positioned. We're well positioned geographically. We're well positioned with our deep ice-free ports, Mr. Speaker. And the work that is being carried on is not a short-term vision for this province. It's a long-term vision, Mr. Speaker, and I believe that we can capture that opportunity.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
First
I guess his long-term view means things have to get worse first. The Port of Halifax reached a traffic high of about 550,000 TEUs in 2005. Since then, its share of international container traffic has been slipping. Despite the huge natural advantages which he just enumerated, including the ice-free deep-water port, the politics of shipping seems to be turned against us right now. So, Mr. Speaker, in the May symposium, the Premier stated, we recognize that the window of opportunity is narrow and that it is right now. So my question for the Premier is this: what is his government doing right now to ensure Halifax Port succeeds with this narrow window of opportunity?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Economic Development, the Deputy Premier, to provide more clarification to the Leader of the Opposition around some of the steps the government is taking around one of the greatest opportunities this province has, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Honourable Leader of the Opposition would, I'm sure, recognize that our efforts in the long term, of course, are to seize upon the emerging markets that are taking place in the world and we have been working very closely with the Port of Halifax in joining their strategy to do that. And Mr. Speaker, we also recognize that in the shorter term, situations such as the rapid increase in the Canadian dollar is having an impact in shipping from traditional markets that are being felt in the short term. But I can assure the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, and all members of the House that we will be out there. We intend to make the Port of Halifax the most efficient port in the North American seaboard. We're going to work with them to ensure that that happens, and we'll be with them as we market this port throughout the world, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his second supplementary.
The Minister is aware that the increase in the Canadian dollar has not affected the Port of Montreal, which has in fact increased its container traffic by 5.9%, while Halifax has been following. The federal government has earmarked $2.1 billion for gateways and border crossings over the next decade. Almost $600 million is going to be spent in BC on the development of the Pacific Gateway. Winnipeg, Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, has already received $35 million for its gateway, developing rail links into the American Midwest. So my question for the Premier is, could he tell Nova Scotians how much money we will be getting for the development of the Atlantic Gateway?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and already the efforts of this government in working with the federal government, contrary to perhaps some of the opinions on the other side that we should be doing, Mr. Speaker, has resulted in this province ensuring that we signed an over $600 million infrastructure agreement with the federal government, Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks. We have already made sure that, Mr. Speaker, we protected our offshore revenues for the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, and we are in the process, through the MOU, of signing an agreement, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that will see millions of dollars coming to the benefit of Atlantic Gateway, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question, again, will be for the Premier. This past October, the Minister of Health announced that the government is going to spend some $50,000 on a third party to investigate a problem with the province's electronic patient records. A computer glitch meant that many lab results, diagnostic test results, including blood tests, skin swabs, X-rays, MRI results, and CT scans, went astray. So my question to the Premier is this: what assurances can he give Nova Scotians that sensitive electronic patient records will no longer be subject to these kinds of computer glitches?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I will refer that to the Minister of Health to provide my colleague with an update.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, that issue has been monitored very closely by our department, making sure that all the information is being transferred to patients as soon as they are available. Mr. Speaker, even with the glitch as it was during October, over 99% of those records did make it to patients on time and in correct fashion.
Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, in fact, investing in technology is a great way to reduce wait times, especially if the technology is safe and effective. As we outlined in the shorter wait times options paper, greater access to electronic patient files will help attract and retain young doctors, especially in rural areas. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister is, can the Minister tell the House what the government is doing to expand the use of electronic patient files throughout Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And over the last couple of years, we've had the opportunity to expand the electronic patient record when it comes to PACS, or the picture archiving system, making sure that all diagnostics do feed into one system. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work through Doctors Nova Scotia, through our offices, to make sure that we talk to primary health care physicians, family doctors, and those individuals to get them on the system. Mr. Speaker, we still have about 30% on the system, and so we've still got a lot of work to do to get more doctors on this so valuable system for Nova Scotians.
Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Interesting that the Minister should say that this happens over the last couple of years, because despite what the Minister says, there is a growing body of evidence that shows he is doing very little to improve health care in this province. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table, if I may, from the 2007 Capital District Health Authority business plan, and I quote, Capital Health has not received any provincial funding over the past several years for system development and upgrades. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, why has this government failed in its responsibility to improve health care?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Capital Health being our largest health district in the province, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in order to operate their system for all Nova Scotians, being the tertiary care network for all Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, just one example that I can hit on is we provided through our agreement with the federal government over $24 million for radiology and radio systems for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, libraries, large and small, urban or rural, are critically important to every single community in this province. Despite the calls by many regional libraries for increased funding, the Minister and the Department stood silent, or many were forced to reduce operating hours, slash community programs, and cut office staff. After months of stalling, the Minister finally responded to the cries of regional libraries and announced a task force to examine library funding. So my question to the Minister is, why did she wait so long to respond to the needs of libraries?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, and Mr. Speaker, through to the member opposite. I thank you for the question. As Minister and within my department and from our provincial government here, I think it's important to recognize, and we do recognize, the value of libraries in our communities. There are 9 library boards across the province, 77 provincial libraries, and we fund those libraries to the best of our ability. I will recognize that the base funding for those libraries had not increased over a couple of years prior to this current budget year. But what we did in this last budget year was increase their base by $1 million, and that certainly was an asset for them. We recognize it may not be enough, but it's certainly a beginning.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regional libraries have been calling for increased funding for months. Many libraries, such as Kibreton, Cumberland, Pictou-Antigonish, in the western region, are just a few of the libraries that have put into crisis mode due to the lack of provincial funding. Mr. Speaker, the task force announced by the Minister will only report back with recommendations next spring. Next spring is far too long for libraries that are in desperate need of financial aid immediately. Many libraries have been forced into cost-saving measures and reduced programming. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister show leadership and respond to the financial needs of regional libraries immediately?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I do recognize the ongoing costs and the operating costs and the escalating costs of libraries. To that end, I met with the Library Board in Truro within the last month, and what I asked them to do was to let me know what their pressures were at this point for the balance of this budget year, and once I have that information, I will respond.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cumberland Regional Library alone has had to make sacrifices to their library and their community program. Chief Librarian Francis Newman has stated that the library had to cut back on a preschool reading program aimed at introducing toddlers to books. Instead of the program being offered every week, it is now being offered once a month. Ms. Newman further indicated that there has been a 49% decrease in the number of programs the regional library provided between April and September of this year compared to last year. So my question to the ministers, will the minister stop forcing regional libraries to cut education programs and commit to additional funding?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the library boards for working to provide the level of service that they have in the past. Also, that I recognize their challenges, and as I've indicated, I'm prepared to work with them and work through those challenges. Thank you very much.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Last week, the Premier stated we needed private hospitals to help reduce wait times, but at the same time, he said he's not in favour of queue jumping. I quote from his statement at the Nova Scotia Chamber of Commerce. I'm not in favour of queue jumping by individuals, nor am I in favour of people waiting too long for appropriate procedures. We need to be innovative, and that means working more with the private sector, end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, how does the Premier propose to shorten wait times by taking doctors out of the public health care system, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable the Premier. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was very clear in what I had stated during my address, Mr. Speaker, and that is we need to ensure that we put in the appropriate protocols, the safeguards, Mr. Speaker, to protect our public system, Mr. Speaker. But we also have to be innovative in our thinking and work with the private sector, no differently than we do with his former employer, a private sector company, Mr. Speaker, in the healthcare system.
The Honourable the member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Premier doesn't know, they're a not-for-profit company, Mr. Speaker, and the Department of Health owns all the equipment that EMC uses, Mr. Speaker. Private hospitals promote queue jumping, Mr. Speaker, while the public wait times lengthen. You don't have to take my word for it. The president of the Canadian Medical Association, Dr. Brian Day, said he has twice used his connections and money to get ahead in line. Once to get an MRI and once to get knee surgery, Mr. Speaker. Is that what this Premier wants? Mr. Speaker, does he want the rich and powerful to use their influence to get preferred treatment while other Nova Scotians suffer because he privatized our healthcare system?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, EMC will be very interested to learn that they're not in it to make a profit, Mr. Speaker, because indeed I believe the member may want to take a look at his statements. Mr. Speaker, I said very clearly, Mr. Speaker, we believe in the parameters of the Canada Health Act. Mr. Speaker, we believe in a publicly funded system, Mr. Speaker. We do not believe that you should be put forward in any lineup, Mr. Speaker, because of the size of your wallet. We don't stand for that type of healthcare system in Nova Scotia, and we never will, Mr. Speaker. But we do believe in partnering. We do believe in being innovative. We do believe that the public of Nova Scotia deserve to know that when they go to a clinic, that the standards and the protection is there for them for the health care that they receive.
The Honourable the member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the Premier should look at their website where it states they're a not-for-profit company. This government has simply not thought things through, Mr. Speaker. Private hospitals do not provide better, faster service. But what they do, Mr. Speaker, is make profits for their investors. Just last week, a man died at a private hospital in Brampton after waiting more than 12 hours in the emergency room with severe abdominal pain, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why does this Premier want to embrace private health care instead of protecting the health services we have currently under the public system?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague and his party are stuck in the past, Mr. Speaker, and I will refer this to the Minister of Health to add to my answer.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of examples around Canada that show that private-public partnerships work. That private delivery of public services does work, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is Trillium Healthcare in Ontario that works very well. It is a model for healthcare in Canada. Mr. Speaker, there's the Diamond Centre, which, Mr. Speaker, back December, I believe, of last year, I had the opportunity to visit Vancouver. I had a couple of critics with me that had the opportunity to visit the Diamond Centre, which is a P3 organization. And the comment with the member from
Order,
Queens,
please.
if I remember correctly, was that this is the kind of thing that we need here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable the member for Halifax Citadel. The Honourable the member for Halifax Citadel has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I have another question about a very successful public-private partnership, the Cornwallis contract. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Immigration. Leo Karunayaka came to Halifax from Sri Lanka in January 2007 as part of the nominee program. He was a bank manager in Sri Lanka, and he hoped that the $130,000 he paid to the program would land him a job with a company where he could use those skills. After searching for 7 months, Mr. Karunayaka was pressured by the Office of Immigration to take a job, any job. He ended up being hired by a local restaurant, but was not assigned any work.
Order, please. Continue.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Karunayaka signed up for mentoring in good faith and with the blessing of the Office of Immigration, and he didn't get what he paid for. So my question, and now he wants his $130,000 back. My question to the Minister, will he reconsider the decision not to provide refunds to deserving immigrant nominees who did not get a fair shake from his department and the mentorship program?
The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I think there's two questions there. As I've stated previously, I think in the very first question in this House, I will not respond to individual cases. That's shut and dry. As far as the issue of the rebates for those 203 people who have gone through the program and where the monies have already been dispersed, it's been made very, very clear. Those monies have been dispersed. They have all, in accordance with the program, signed a successful mentorship, even if the individuals are saying that there may have been some problems, but those individuals have gone through the program, and those funds have been expended, Mr. Speaker, and at this point in time, there will not be any further refunds in the program.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Citadel on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, not only will the office not respond to these requests for information, but he will not even give any files to the Auditor General on his handling of these files. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Karuniaka asked for a refund from the Minister's Department, and he was given three choices. He could continue in his mentorship job, use loosely here because he never started it, start a new mentorship with the same employer, or abandon the program and lose all of his $130,000. My question to the Minister is, does he consider these to be reasonable choices to offer to an individual who has been taken off by a failed program established by his office and this government?
The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like some clarification from the member what particular documents we won't hand over, and I'd like some clarification on that right now. Maybe you could expand a little bit on what files. Were they the files that were handed over to the committee? The 560 documents that were handed over that were eventually released into the public domain by the chair of the committee and were never properly protected, and the individual names that we have an obligation to protect were still visible for over 7 days in our library to the public. And there is an obligation on our part, a legal obligation, to ensure the privacy of individuals. So maybe you could clarify that for me, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Citadel on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the Minister to ask the Auditor General because he's asking those questions. Mr. Speaker, this government approved of the businesses in the mentorship program, and in Mr. Karuniaka's case, the employer first told him not to bother reporting for work, and after the program came under public scrutiny in October, the employer asked Mr. Karuniaka to come to work. Then on December 7th, this week, Mr. Speaker, the employer wrote to Mr. Karuniaka terminating his employment for not coming to work. It's ironic, he's in fact been fired from a job that he is paying for 5 times over. My question to the Minister is, will his department help Mr. Karuniaka recover some of his money from this company, which was recommended by the Office of Immigration, which we've received tens of thousands of dollars for doing almost nothing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, and I've made it very clear, any monies that have been expended have been expended. And the other thing, too, here is, Mr. Speaker, it was made one of the key criteria, and I think this is critical, Mr. Speaker, in the program. There was to be no cost, and I repeat, no cost to the taxpayer of this province with regard to the nominee program. This government has made sure that's happened, all in the while, Mr. Speaker, increasing immigration in this province, bringing over 6,900 immigrants into this province between 2001 and 2006. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe it's a failed program. I believe the immigration in this province is extremely successful. Thank you.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act. In the throne speech that opened this session of the legislature, the government talked at length about the new Nova Scotia and their commitment and pride in the small business sector. One quote from that speech is, "From one end of our province to the other, local entrepreneurs are using their ingenuity and determination to make a better future." You also say, well, let's be careful about hypocrisy. Mr. Speaker, it also says that this new Nova Scotia is getting out of the way of business growth by cutting red tape and taxes. My question for the minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act, my question is, can you tell the House if your government is willing to review regulations that appear to inhibit business growth and innovation in this province?
The Honourable the Minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I believe the member is probably referring to UVents. Mr. Speaker, back in 2002-2003, that issue and the policy was reviewed, and the policy arrived at, and the one that we're living by today is, I believe, and I believe our government believes, strikes a balance between the consumer and those hobby winemakers as well. So, Mr. Speaker, at this point in time, that is the policy, and that's what this government lives by, and there's no intent of this government at this point in time to review that.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park on our first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I was indeed speaking about UVents and brew on premises. If that were allowed in this province, as it is in others, it's allowed right now in British Columbia, Ontario, and even in our neighbouring New Brunswick. It helps small business, it meets consumer demand, it helps older and disabled customers, and it provides convenience and service to customers. I call that innovation, and I call that customer service. Mr. Speaker, the previous minister for the Liquor Commission gave me a similar answer, and I believe this Tory government needs to wake up and step into the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister directly, will your government commit to re-examining the practice of on-site brewing in Nova Scotia in light of the fact that New Brunswick allows it?
The Honourable the Minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act.
Mr. Speaker, I look for your direction with regard to answering that question where there is a current bill before the House.
I thought he asked me to make the ruling. From what I understand, that this question is with enough breadth that you can answer the generalities of the question.
Mr. Speaker, I'll try to answer very generally. Mr. Speaker, we have a thriving, it's a young but a thriving wine industry in this province. Mr. Speaker, my main concern is that the UVents currently use no or little or no Nova Scotia content in their wine-making kits. Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure that for the future of the agricultural industry here in this province, that whatever our decision is protects the wine industry in this province, because we have a wonderful wine industry, Mr. Speaker, and that's the bottom line.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park on our final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity to speak to the wine industry as well, and they don't see this as a direct competition to their activities. In fact, it enhances it. Mr. Speaker, the government says it wants to have a new Nova Scotia, but it sends a signal to business that the only way you can get things changed in this province is through the courts. My question to the minister is this: will you live up to your new Nova Scotia rhetoric and step up and update the Liquor Control Act to allow brew on premises?
The Honourable the Minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act.
I can't, with regard to the bill, Mr. Speaker, I guess generally speaking, all I can say is that my number one concern for this province with regard to the wine industry is to ensure its success. Whatever this government does will be in that regard. And Mr. Speaker, that's what all I can say on the subject, really.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. After 8 years of cutting long-term beds in Nova Scotia, the government has finally changed directions and announced critically needed nursing homes for Nova Scotia. This will be well received by some communities, Mr. Speaker. However, the news was not good for many small rural communities whose projects received no bids. I'll table an article from the December 8th Chronicle Herald that outlined 9 communities whose projects didn't receive a bid. The RFP process was daunting, and it turned off many small proponents early on, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister, why were these projects made so unattractive that nobody bid on them?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that on Friday we had the first batch of standalone facilities that we're able to announce. Mr. Speaker, I look at probably the end of this week that we'll make the announcement on the attachment beds, or the beds that will be additions to existing homes. All communities that were listed will be covered under this report. Thank you.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'll quote from the minister from the article I mentioned a few minutes ago. I quote, "We can't coerce people into building facilities, so we might have to move from one community to another community to try to get them as close as possible, but to some place that actually wants them." End quote. To think, Mr. Speaker, that the minister thinks Chester, New Ross, River Herbert, Advocate Harbour, Parsbro, Guysborough, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't want these long-term care facilities. So I'd like to ask the minister, since most projects are attached to existing facilities, why not give the money to the district health authorities to put the units in place instead of moving the projects out of these communities?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just wondering where he got the idea that we're going to be moving them out of those communities. Mr. Speaker, our intention is to put them in those communities, and we will be putting them in those communities.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary. Order, please. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had complaints from small operators and non-profit proponents that the RFP process was tilted in favour of the larger companies. The costs were prohibited to smaller operators who might have liked projects in rural communities. So I'd like to ask the minister, why won't he admit that the process was flawed and start working with small operators and non-profit groups instead of blaming them, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just wondering which of those 500 beds does he not want? Does he want to? Is there a community that he does not want to have those beds? Mr. Speaker, this was a rigorous RFP process, I admit. Mr. Speaker, we wanted to make sure that as soon as we made those announcements that beds can be constructed, not, again, waving a magic wand and expecting them built like the NDP would try to convince Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the minister responsible for gaming. Mr. Speaker, over the past few months, we have heard how an untendered multi-million-dollar contract for Internet bingo was awarded to a Swedish firm by the Atlantic Lottery Corporation. We've since heard testimony from the CEO of ALC who believes they did nothing wrong and they, quote, "Yes, I would do it all over again." The ALC did not even announce the contract until almost a full year after it was awarded. My question, Minister, do you believe that the ALC followed the proper course in awarding this contract?
Minister responsible for the Gaming Control Act.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the honourable member would know, the ALC operates with a board of directors. We have members from Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation as members of that board of directors. I have written to them expressing the concern of the government of Nova Scotia with respect to the confidence level the people of Nova Scotia have with respect to the operations of ALC, and have asked that they satisfy themselves that the interests of Nova Scotia are indeed being looked after through the operation of that company.
The Honourable the Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The performance review is one step out of several which need to take place to bring accountability and integrity back to the gaming industry in this province. Premier and the Minister have been silent on demanding that ALC fully comply with the Atlantic Procurement Agreement. Nova Scotians expect that contracts will be awarded fairly and in an open process. My question to the Minister is, will you demand that ALC become fully compliant with the Atlantic Procurement Agreement?
The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the ALC is indeed been made aware of the requirements with respect to procurement. And, Mr. Speaker, it is our expectation that they should be operating in a manner that all Nova Scotians would have confidence in their operation.
The Honourable the Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, one voice has been silent since the story broke about the ALC and this untendered contract, and that has been the voice of the premiers. Nova Scotia is the most significant shareholder to the ALC, and apparently this does not concern our premier. There was a secret search, secret criteria, secret negotiations, and then a secret contract. This is no way to do business with the public money. My question to the Premier is, will you step in and collaborate with the other Atlantic provinces, Atlantic premiers, and demand better procurement practices from the ALC?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when a government minister speaks, Mr. Speaker, and puts forward a message, they put it forward on behalf of the government of this province, Mr. Speaker, and I am very proud to lead that government.
The Honourable the Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the results of the Progress in Reading Literacy International Study were published. The study compares grade 4 literacy across 40 countries in the OECD. One of the study's key findings was that girls read better at grade 4 than boys. The PISA study highlights that this gender gap is particularly pronounced in Nova Scotia. Girls score on average 22 points higher than boys in reading. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister how she plans to tackle this gender gap in literacy.
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, thank you for the question, and certainly appreciate and quite like the statistics that the minister shared, or the member shared. But however, I do take that seriously. One of the things that we do within our department is focus on assessment. We recognize that early detection and early intervention are key, and these results are telling us that there's an issue with gender that we have to address, and we'll be prepared to do that.
The Honourable the Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am very interested in the literacy study because it proves conclusions that we, the NDP, have been talking about for years. For example, children who have parents who promote reading do better in literacy at school. For most people, this is an accepted wisdom. This report proves that is the case. So my second question to the minister is, when is the minister going to increase funding to adult literacy programs so that they can help parents to enjoy and promote reading?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, we recognize the importance of parents reading to their children. We also recognize that having books in the hands of preschoolers is important, and to that end, if members will remember, I did make a visit to a school and presented to the pre-primary students and their parents kits with reading materials so that process could begin at home. We also recognize that the Read to Me program, sponsored with the Department of Health and which we support, puts reading materials into the hands of parents prior to students coming to school. And we also recognize that within my department there's a very active adult literacy program, and I am very pleased and satisfied that we are reaching the lives of many adult learners and helping them become literate.
The Honourable the Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another interesting finding from this report is that students with access to an early education program experience increased success in reading. A good early education program can reduce the need for resource teaching if student learning disabilities are identified and supported from an early age. However, there is no sign that the minister plans to increase the early education pilot program in place. So my final question to the minister is, what is her government's policy on early childhood education for every child in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the member has mentioned the pre-primary early childhood programs that we have in place. We had a 3-year pilot. We developed a very appropriate curriculum for pre-primary. We monitored the implementation of that and the outcome of that. And we are very pleased to say that we have the conclusive evidence to show that early intervention does make a difference in the readiness of students when they come to primary. And we are taking that information and we're taking those results and using them when we look at the change of entry dates so we get those students in our schools earlier than now.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Citadel. Halifax Shabukto, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Today, the world's diplomatic and environmental community is in Bali, Indonesia, discussing the need to take very aggressive action to prevent the planet's overall atmospheric temperature from increasing by a very dangerous 2 degrees Celsius. We know that the federal government is not interested in action to reduce emissions. The federal Conservatives will only fund programs that deal with the consequences of global warming after the damage has been done. That's a leadership vacuum at the national level, so it becomes all the more important that other levels of government lead the way. So tomorrow, the Council of Atlantic Premiers meets. I asked the Premier what steps he will bring to his fellow Atlantic Canadian premiers to bring forward to make sure that Nova Scotia and the other Atlantic provinces lead the charge against global climate change.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question from my honourable colleague, who I know does have a deep interest in environmental issues. And Mr. Speaker, not only will we have this on our agenda tomorrow, talking about various items regarding the environment and energy, but in fact, Mr. Speaker, if my honourable colleague will take a look at the communiques put out from the Council of the Federation, both of the Atlantic Premiers and Eastern Governors meetings, Mr. Speaker, he will see that this has always been a priority for all of us that are involved in those groups, Mr. Speaker. And I am very proud because each and every meeting that I go to, I talk about the goals that we have set forward in our environmental goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, which not only, Mr. Speaker, are positive steps for this province, but are even more aggressive than that of the federal government.
The Honourable the member for Halifax Shabukto on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act set goals for greenhouse gas reductions by the year 2020, but those are inadequate goals and with no clear means of implementing the policies that will meet these meagre goals. So setting targets 12 years out with no accountability for our annual progress was already tried. The Paul Martin government did it. It didn't work. My question for the Premier is what measures is he going to bring forward to ensure that Nova Scotia is actually progressing year to year in meeting its greenhouse gas reduction targets?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when the honourable member takes a look at what this government put forward in that act, you'll see very clearly that this government is not just a government that is talking the talk. We are walking the walk, Mr. Speaker. And a good example of that was last week with the protection of moorland, with the Ship Harbour Long Lake area, which environmentalists in this province are calling a true success and partnership between the private sector, government, and non-governmental organizations.
The Honourable the member for Halifax Shabukto on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in 1990, the environmental community told the government of the day that it had to do something about greenhouse gas emissions, and now the environmental community in the Atlantic provinces under an umbrella group is now pointing out that we actually have to make some of the largest greenhouse gas reductions in the country in the Atlantic area. So I would like to ask the Premier why he simply won't admit that his stated target is grossly inadequate.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I will refer that to the Minister of Environment, Mr. Speaker, who can further talk about the levels that we have put forward in the Act.
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for the question from the Honourable Member. The Honourable Member will well be aware that the goals that were set in the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act were goals that were set in tandem with Quebec, the other eastern provinces of the New England states. Those goals are very aggressive goals, Mr. Speaker, and the member will know that in the famous movie, The Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore specifically reference the New England states as being amongst the leaders, and those are the targets, Mr. Speaker, that we have adopted for this province and we are going to deliver on.
The Honourable, the member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, Dartmouth High School, like many other schools in Nova Scotia, is in desperate need of renovations. Because of years of deferred maintenance, many students are receiving an education in subpar classrooms. Parents, teachers, and school administrators have long advocated for renovations due to the building's steady deterioration. Despite the efforts of the School Advisory Council and the countless attempts to have the school prioritized, this government has turned its back on the project. My question to the Minister, why has the Minister neglected the renovation needs of Dartmouth High School?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I'm pleased to be able to speak to the capital construction program that we currently have. The 2003 capital construction list that was approved by Cabinet at that time brought schools, new schools, renovated schools, or additions to existing schools to 57 communities across this province. And that's a $400 million plus commitment, and we are going to stick to that commitment, and that will look after the needs that have been identified. And on that list, we continually work with school boards to have them bring back to us any new needs that they may have or any changing priorities. And so we're always constantly working with the school boards and the school communities.
The Honourable, the member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on June 22, 2005, the Halifax Regional School Board approved a motion that would clarify its list of requested school capital construction projects. Among the board's top priorities was Dartmouth High. The motion further accentuated the school's priority by stating Dartmouth High School's urgent needs for capital repairs be given serious consideration. In other words, a stitch in time would save millions. My question to the Minister, will the Minister listen to HRSB's requests and finally make renovations at Dartmouth High School a priority?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did have an opportunity to accept an invitation to visit Dartmouth High. I did tour that school. I spoke with School Advisory Council folks and with students and staff there. And there's no question there are needs in that school, and they are being considered by my department for our next round of construction.
The Honourable, the member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the gymnasium is in dire need of repair. Hardboard panels along the roof contain asbestos. Most of the windows are original and need replacement, and the school's ventilation systems are out of date. Science labs are outdated, and delivering the PSP is extremely challenging. These are just a few of the repairs that students, teachers, and school administrators have been waiting for. My question to the Minister, will the Minister commit to making Dartmouth High School a priority and begin renovations immediately?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as everyone in this House knows, I take seriously the conditions of all of the schools in our province and work closely with the school boards. But I also would recognize that it is within our financial means that we address those. And again, I've said this earlier, but if we need to make some adjustments within our budget lines, we have some places we could go. Thank you very much.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic.
Good, wasn't it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Affairs. In 1985, this House passed special legislation to create a multi-service centre to address in coordinated, comprehensive health, educational, cultural, recreational and social services for the residents of Mainland South, and to build a specific building to deliver these services. This is how the Captain William Spry Community Centre was built. In the mid-1990s, Service Exchange relieved municipalities of all social service responsibilities, and the centre was turned over to the new Halifax Regional Municipality. My question to the Minister is, what agreements were in place, and what did the province get in exchange for turning over its investment in the centre which it had helped to build?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
To be quite frank, Mr. Speaker, it's an interesting question, and as the Minister for Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations, I'm not sure that the province fared all that well in the service exchange. I think municipalities came out far ahead because the province picked up the cost for long-term care and community services. In exchange, one of the things in the William Spry Centre would fall into that, the responsibility for recreation and recreation facilities was given to the municipalities.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that very candid response. As you may be aware, several provincial programs and social service-related community groups have recently been forced out of the Captain Spry Centre as the Halifax Regional Municipality redesigns the centre for its exclusively recreational purposes. This has left critical provincial programs, including addictions and various community services projects, looking for a new home. These services must be maintained in this community. So I ask the Minister, how will the government redirect its investment to ensure that its original aims are fulfilled and supports these now homeless provincial services, projects and organizations?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, the redesign of the William Spry Centre, which has been sort of a corner piece of the Spryfield area, certainly the question probably in terms of its use is better addressed to HRM because they are the ones that have made this decision. My colleagues in the Department of Community Services and the Health, as well as my colleague in Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, will be the ones that will be faced with the decision of where to relocate so that they can continue to serve the residents of that area in the near future.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic on our final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope I'm correct in understanding that this means that the province will, in fact, in these various departments, maintain its responsibilities in this community, because this is integrated service delivery, and it has worked in this community. However, this integrated service delivery has now lost the space from which to work. So I ask the Minister, will your department work with the community to ensure that these multi-service programs can continue their work in Spryfield?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for that. And government does work with communities in a variety of ways and through a variety of departments, whether it's transportation, infrastructure renewal, my Department of Health, Department of Community Services, Department of Immigration or Economic Development. We do a lot of things. And Mr. Speaker, government will continue